must gather to cast powerful spells, some of the oldest and most powerful in the history of Magic the Gathering. Jeweled Lotus, Black Lotus, Mox Lotus, and many others. Battling head-to-head in brutal combat, they all have one thing in common: to uphold their legacy and the search for eternal glory.
The Eternal Glory podcast is brought to you by the minds behind BoshNRoll on YouTube, Thraben University, and theepicstorm.com. This episode is sponsored by 3-for-1 Trading and Sparks Law Practice.
Hello, and welcome to episode 135 of the Eternal Glory podcast, EW Asia results and what not to play. We've already recorded 30 minutes of introduction and banter for the week, available in our supporter-exclusive pre-show. Check out patreon.com/eternalglory to gain access, or join as a YouTube member for the same content on YouTube instead. Back in action this week, I'm Phil Gallagher, aka ThrabenU.
I am Brian Coval, aka BoshNRoll.
And I'm Brian Cook of the Epic Storm. And Phil, you take one episode off and you're already messing up the intro? Come on, man.
Absolutely. I'm a fucking joker over here.
I love that he flubbed a line 3 seconds into recording, and instead of just, let's start again, we're just not only sending it, but then having a conversation about it. This is everything that you're not supposed to do in show business, but it makes us human.
Thanks for listening to the Eternal Glory podcast.
Yeah. And if you want to support us more, alongside new Patreon and YouTube subscribers since the last one, we've got Marin C, Joshin, Victor R, Leviathan 6, and Colin S. Shout out to all of them who have access to the pre-show this week. And you can hear me respond to some weirdo who seems to think that I'm in charge of Psychic Frog.
This episode is brought to you by Sparks Law, a business transactional law firm owned by Eternal Magic community member Jonathan Sparks. If you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or gig worker looking to start your own company, Sparks Law can help with partnership agreements, contract reviews, intellectual property protection, or any other business legal questions. If you want to shape your business strategy with a fellow Eternal gamer, reach out via email to jsparks, that's JSPARKS, at sparkslawpractice.com, or call 470-268-5234.
And if you would like to advertise to over 10,000 plus Eternal gamers every single episode, reach out to us. We're always accepting new sponsors. That said, that 10,000 plus listeners does not include Spotify at the moment. Sorry for all of you Spotify listeners, but there is a known issue with SoundCloud right now. Our episodes are not being published there. SoundCloud is working on getting those episodes over to Spotify.
Shout out to everyone who alerted us to this issue, and the pod has still been up on any other platform, including YouTube and our own website, theeternalglorypodcast.com. You can always find them there.
All right, let's go ahead and just kind of delve directly into our main episode topic here. Let's talk about Eternal Weekend Asia, a 614 player legacy event with some juicy information for everyone who is going to be looking to play in the other Eternal Weekend events.
Yeah, the top 8 here seems to be just the top metagame on MTG Goldfish, according to MTGO. That's fun.
Yeah, these results, I think, were very expected. As far as our top 8 goes, we're looking at Red Prison, 2 Eldrazi, Bant Cephalid Breakfast, 3 Blue-Black Reanimator deck lists, and 1 4-color Up the Beanstalk deck list. And I want to kind of delve into these deck lists here for the things that might be notable about them, especially if you're not super current on Legacy. There is some hot tech in here. And let's start with the champion deck list, a thing of just pure beauty.
The Barbarians won.
The Barbarians did indeed win. This is Moon Stompy. Now, this deck list features a couple of non-conventional choices. First being Vexing Bauble in the main deck. This is something that I have been pushing really hard on Ancient Tomb players, and I am glad that it is seeing more and more play over Chalice of the Void. Pyrogoyf is seeing play here. which is Flame Tongue Kavu, but power crept through Modern Horizons lens. And I've been pretty impressed by that card in recording.
Yeah, Phil, you did it. You mentioned Pyrogoyf probably like 6 weeks ago on the pod, 3 or 4 episodes ago. And I was like, yeah, I'm really into that card in Vintage Cube. It's a high pick for me. And then I'm just seeing it as 4 ofs in Red Stompy basically ever since then. The Vexing Bauble stuff, the Pyrogoyf stuff. I don't know if they're getting their information from you or if you're just right and they found it on their own, but I have found the Red Stompy list that I'm playing against and the ones I look at in my general perusing of the format look like the decks that you were describing 6 weeks ago.
Not entirely washed, despite the fact that I'm not really playing tournaments anymore. Nailed it. Now, the most interesting thing here, I think, from the entire deck list is actually a throwback card. Lilia, the Blade Reforged. This is the 2/2 haste Spirit Warrior. Whenever it attacks, exile the top card of your library. You can play that card this turn. And whenever 1 or more cards are put into exile from your library or graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on it.
Another Vintage Cube banger.
Okay, so conceptually, why are people playing that? I'm going to answer my own question. That was rhetorical.
Please do.
So, in a recent super qualifier, I think winning deck list, the deck list had a whopping 12 4-drops, opting to play playsets of the One Ring and Pyrogoyf and Caves of Chaos Adventure. And immediately I saw that list and I went, that's too many 4-drops. I'm going to record a video with that. I'm going to just see if I'm right. And it felt like too many 4-drops. And so to see this EW deck list under my same general philosophy of this is too many 4-drops, you have to go down to some 3-drops. I think that was very, very wise. And they didn't just jam Goblin Rabblemaster, which maybe is not going to be great, attacking with your 1/1 hasty Goblin tokens into Metamorphosis Fanatics. So I think this was a great metagame choice.
Yeah, Lelia is sick. And I know I've mentioned Vintage Cube twice already, and this is a different thing, but the identity of the Vintage Cube lately, the Magic Online Cube, for the color red, is not burn anymore. They cut Sulfuric Vortex and Goblin Guide and all that kind of stuff from the cube, and it's just morphed into stick a permanent that gains you value every turn it exists. Things like Gut, the True Soul Zealot, Lelia, Pyrogoyf, Broadside Bombardiers, and that play pattern is really effective. And my experience grinding Vintage Cube over the last month and a half for the Ultimate Guard thing at Magic-Con Vegas was that I actually really like red, and I like the play patterns of red when they're doing this sort of thing. My criticisms of red in the past, especially Red Stompy, are you got to mulligan to a 3-mana hand, you need it, you mulligan to 6 already, then you got to pitch something to a Chrome Mox, then you got to play an Ancient Tomb, then you cast a spell, you got 2 cards left in your hand, it gets dazed, and then you lose. And you're just praying at the top of your deck every turn. And I hate that. That really is antithetical to everything I want out of a Magic deck. But if you're playing cards like Lelia and the One Ring, where you have the explosive start and then solid card advantage to catch back up after your opponent absorbs some of that explosive start, that's really scary.
You want me to rustle your jimmies even more?
Please.
4x Ghost Vacuum in the sideboard combos with Lelia's second ability whenever 1 or more cards are put into exile from your library or graveyard.
Okay. Jimmy's rustled. You got a little combat trick built into your graveyard hate. I want to talk about Ghost Vacuum a little bit too while it's mentioned, because it'll come up a few times in this episode. We were mid on it in our set review, where it's just kind of this is half an unlicensed hearse with some flavor text on it. Urza Saga can get it, but is it going to be better than a Soul Guide Lantern or an Isle Spellbomb or the things you can already get out of Urza Saga? And it turns out, in this current metagame, half of an unlicensed hearse is fine if you're spending half the mana to get it. That is just an efficient 1-mana thing you can do. I did win a game on camera on my channel where my opponent tunnel visioned on actually activating the vacuum, the 6-mana part, to the point where they just didn't wasteland me when I was missing land drops because they were trying to get up to 6, and they eventually got to 6, but I had dug out and it was completely irrelevant. So don't get confused by the flavor text on that card. It'll come up sometimes, but mostly it doesn't. But if you're playing it as just a hyper efficient half of an unlicensed hearse, you'll probably be happy with that.
So regarding Ghost Vacuum, I think it's better in the non-blue decks than the blue decks, because I think the non-blue decks have a more realistic chance of actually activating the 6 mana ability. I recorded with Blue-Black Reanimator today, playing a couple of those in the sideboard. And halfway through my match, I was just like, wait, how many actual mana sources are in my deck now that I've used a couple of Wastelands? And it's very close to the number 6 if you use your Wastelands. Like, I think there were like 7 mana producing lands in the deck or something like that. And it is actually pretty hard to activate in some of those lower to the ground Daze decks.
Right. You just have to not register that card with hopes of putting a 1/1 Archon of Cruelty into play. Sometimes it'll happen. It usually won't. But think of it like an unlicensed hearse that can't attack. And I think that is the sweet spot for it. And you'll be pleasantly surprised once in a while when you do have 6 mana and it's ready to activate it.
So before we get too deep into this, I would like to just make a quick note of something. There's a Magic account called Play MTG that is official Wizards of the Coast account, where they tweeted about a Pioneer RCQ that had other sweet events, including a vintage tournament giving out exclusive promo cards. I felt like this was such a weird way to talk about Eternal Weekend Asia. And yeah, like, oh yeah, Eternal Weekend Asia is just tacked onto this RCQ and it doesn't matter. And it's like pretty disrespectful to like one of the largest events of the year for both vintage and legacy. I wanted to talk about this before we got too deep into the results, but I was just a little dumbfounded by that. Also, Phil, I'm happy for you in Red Prison.
I didn't see this post and I'm looking for it now. I want to be enraged myself, just directly.
All right, I'll start talking about Eldrazi while you do your research.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so there were 2 Eldrazi decks in the top 8, and you're going to see more beyond the top 8 as well. And I think one of the most notable things from this was a playset of Talisman of Curiosity. That is the blue-green Talisman in the main deck, or sorry, I think it was a 3 main deck, 1 sideboard split of one of these deck lists. And this is conceptually a way to more consistently be able to get to 4 mana on turn 2, specifically for sowing Mycospawn. As the earlier you play that card and just wasteland your opponent out of the game, the more powerful it tends to be.
I'm rage retweeting this tweet right now. I'm sure you said something really insightful about Eldrazi, but yeah, this tweet is fucking disrespectful. Oh my god. Yeah, Pioneer may be the focus in Shizuoka this weekend, but in addition to the regional championship, there are also a ton of other events being held. Including a vintage tournament with almost 200 entrants, all doing battle for prizes such as exclusive promo cards. And then there's like a picture of a Black Lotus in play and then a promo Tinker. Come on. Like, you take our paintings and now you can't even name Eternal Weekend. You can't even say it. You don't speak its name. Like, I don't think this is a grand conspiracy to squash out Legacy and Vintage. We've been on the edge of Wizards' attention for decades now. Like, they can't print cards. They can't sell cards to us anymore. So, like, what good are we other than they try to just keep Magic playable for everyone? But this is some disrespectful stuff. Sorry, Phil. I'm sure you were talking about Eldrazi. Go ahead. Sowing Mycospawn?
Sowing Mycospawn confirmed good. We can move on from that. Notably, though, some of these Eldrazi decks also have 4 Ghost Vacuum in the sideboard. So it is just kind of something to be aware of. Like, in one of these, I think even had them in the main deck. Yeah, the second place one has main deck Ghost Vacuum. Like, please be aware of that card. It is very, very real right now.
For what it's worth, I think the best graveyard hate card isn't Leyline of the Void, it's not Ghost Vacuum or Surgical Extraction. I really do believe right now, if you're not playing Fairy Macabre, you should be asking yourself why. Like, even the graveyard decks, like, I attempted to record a Reanimator variant earlier today, did not go well, and I ended up scrapping the league. After 3 matches, I had 0 game wins, but it was playing Vexing Bauble. And if people are playing Vexing Bauble to protect their graveyard, Fairy Macabre makes so much sense. And I'm not sure if I'm sold by Ghost Vacuum and all these other options you have right now. And that doesn't even mention one of the decks that made top 8, which is Cephalid Breakfast, which has Orm's Chant and Teferi Time Raveler, where your Fairy Macabres gain a little bit more value in that matchup.
Yeah, Macabre is, I think, at the highest number it's ever been. I don't have data for that, but just based on my experience that just blue decks are playing 3 or 4 Macabres, like that has not happened in the history of Legacy.
It also can be countered spell by the blue graveyard deck, which is another thing.
Yeah, that's why Macabre is here. It's because the number 1 deck in the format is a Daze Force of Will fueled Turbo Reanimator deck. That's just us adjusting to what we need to do. When Surgical Extraction is too slow, there's a problem.
So I did mention Cephalid Breakfast. There's been a newer card, well, I should say an older card popping up in newer lists, and you might have noticed it. It's called Memory's Journey. So it's 1 in a blue where you can shuffle up to 3 cards from a graveyard into its owner's library, and then it flashes back for a single green. I had a few people ask me, why would Cephalid Breakfast play this card? And I think it's not really obvious. So Cephalid Breakfast really struggles to beat a Vexing Bauble because Dread Return is a free spell. So how that deck works is you put your Illusionist and your Nomad's Encore in play, you mill your entire library, you hit a couple Narcomoebas, you play Dread Return on Thassa's Oracle, and then you do a little dance. When there's a Vexing Bauble in play, you can't do the last part of that. There is no Dread Return. So instead, you can now Memory's Journey, paying a green mana, and you're already playing green for Nadu, so, that just works well. And then you'll put your Thassa's Oracle on top of your deck. Well, there's another key element to this now, where if your opponent's playing a blue deck, you're also playing 1 Cavern of Souls. You could do your own Doomsday pile. You just put your Thassa's Oracle in your Cavern as the top 2, and you're like, good luck, blue deck, you have to beat this now. And that created another problem. So not only can you do that sort of trick, if you just naturally draw your 1 of Cavern of Souls and name Wizard, Illusionist is a wizard, and Nadu's a wizard. So uncounterable Nadus in the control mirrors is just very good. And I think Cephalid Breakfast picked up, a few pretty good upgrades there. But if you look super closely at the deck list, there's also no more Cabal Therapies in that deck. So you don't have to play bad cards like Underground Sea in this imaginary scenario in which you're casting a Cabal Therapy or a Dread Return.
Yeah, these decks are really impressive.
So I have some data. I pulled up Joe Dyer and the Legacy Data Collection Project spreadsheet from the weekend. In the event, there were 718 copies of Fairy Macabre. To give you some context for that number, there were 759 copies of Daze, 701 copies of Fatal Push, and Fairy Macabre was the 12th most played card in the event. So, very good. Very, very, very good.
Yeah, obviously the 12th most played card, those numbers are, I don't want to say fudged, but they need to be considered that it's a colorless free object. This isn't like metagames where Daze or Fatal Push, the other things that you named on that list, Brainstorm, Ponder, I'm sure were heavily played, they tend to be. But any deck can reach for this if they want it. So that will artificially inflate the numbers, but that's also why it's getting played.
So as far as the boogeyman of the format goes, there were 3 copies of Blue-Black Reanimator in the top 8. And notably, all 3 of those decks were playing Metamorphosis Fanatic in some numbers, either 2 or 3 copies in the main deck.
That thing is major stupid. We were reserved about it in our set review. When we talked about it, we were like, yeah, this might have a home, but the floor of this is worse than Triumph of St. Traft. It turns out that in context of the Blue-Black Daze Reanimator deck, a worse Triumph of St. Catherine is still really stupid because unlike the white decks that would play Triumph, where you're saving your removal, you're saving your interaction for 1 point where they deploy one of their thin number of threats out of the deck, this deck just presents a game-ending threat every turn. And the Fanatic just being 4/4 lifelink for 2 is good enough that you might be out of removal by then, especially in a format built around Fatal Push, which doesn't hit Fanatic no matter how revolted you are. And I'm frequently extremely revolted when I have to play against that card. And the chain of if you do anything other than exile the first Fanatic, like if you counter it or you pour Sweet Soul, if you Unholy Heat that thing or double bolt it, it'll be back with the next one. And then that one will bring back the main thing in the graveyard. It's just, it fills the spot that Grief used to fill of being a thing that is very good when you're comboing and totally respectable when you're not. And obviously it's a very different card from Grief. It doesn't enable the same things, but like Grief, you just left in your deck, even when you were in a Reanimator deck, because spending 4 mana on 3/2 Menace Thoughtseize is fine. And you leave Fanatic in your deck even when you've cut the Entombs, because 2 mana 4/4 lifelink that may or may not bring something with it is also fine.
That makes a lot of sense, Brian. I haven't been super impressed from my side of the table because I'm someone that only plays like turbo fast combo decks, but what you're describing made a light bulb go off for me. So I'm glad that you explained it so that way I could actually see your point of view. So I appreciate that. One thing that I've run into in a league though was I thought I was facing Doomsday because my opponent cycled the Street Wraith and then the next turn they Fanatic the Street Wraith back into play. And I was just like, this is wild. Like, what's going on here? So I sent them a message in chat. And they said that there's often just not enough targets in the blue-black Reanimator deck for the Fanatic, so they wanted to try Street Wraith. I'm not sure if that's actually good or not, but I thought it was interesting enough to share.
Yeah, I have seen the Street Wraith builds, which, I mean, it's cool because Street Wraith also triggers Miracle. Like, it sets up more combat blowouts. Like, one Brainstorm can easily set up 7 lifelink power in your opponent's next combat step on the very next turn. Just really sick stuff. I think that is getting cuter than you need to be, and the card is just fine. You could just put it in your deck without any particular setup. And the Buffalo Chicken Dip Legacy had an open last weekend, which was won by Blue Black Reanimator, featuring 1 copy of Witch's Cottage, which is the Mystic Sanctuary for creatures. If you have 3 swamps, you could put a creature from your graveyard on top of your deck. And hey, that's a great way to set up a Fanatic. Or just rebuy a frog, if that's what the game's about.
Yeah, so one thing about the Street Wraith build, though, is you often don't know what you're facing. Because right now, you're thinking Metamorphosis Fanatic, you're thinking Reanimator, but your opponent goes like turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 2 Psychic Frog. That is not any particular deck in Legacy. That is still a wide range of decks. It could be Doomsday. It could be Reanimator. It could be Beanstalk Control. Like, maybe not Thoughtseize, but it's not necessarily an indicator of a whole lot of things. And if you see Street Wraith, my mind starts to move to Doomsday. So maybe they don't board in their Graveyard Hate because Graveyard Hate isn't good against Doomsday.
I've had some similar things where my opponent like fetches and leads on a Tameo, where that is a surprisingly ambiguous opening in the current metagame, because playing sources of card advantage that are low to the ground like Psychic Frog and Tameo is just generally speaking a smart thing to do. There have definitely been more videos recently where I'm not sure what my opponent is playing if I quickly win a game 1.
Right. I had a coaching session just earlier today for someone who hasn't played Legacy since Expressive Iteration was legal and just wanted a quick crash course of what the format's about. And the top 5 decks on MTG Goldfish are Reanimator, Space, Dimir Tempo, Space, Frog Doomsday. Like 3 of the top 5 just all have the same opening sequence and opening lands. Like, there have been Legacy formats in the past where it's like, oh, Wooded Foothills, this must be Rug Delver, or the Epic Storm, because nobody else plays those. Or for a long time, it was like, oh, a Pluto Delta, someone is up to no good here. Like, Pluto Delta isn't played in any fair decks. This is a Flooded Strand Misty Rainforest format right now. Like, there are things you could do in previous formats to quickly deduce just based on a fetch land what your opponent's doing. Now, like Bryant was saying, Underground Sea Frog could be anything. And it's additionally concerning to me that 2 of the top 5 decks, the Blue-Black Reanimator and the Frog Doomsday deck, are strong tempo decks where you need your removal in, that are also strong combo decks that you need to meet on whatever axis they're trying to kill you on. And they're both decks that could either Entomb Reanimate or Dark Ritual Doomsday you on turn 1, or they could just hit you with Frog 2 or 3 times and do whatever perfectly comfortably on turn 7. And it is not healthy for the best aggro deck to also be the best combo deck, best tempo deck, best control deck, best combo deck. They're kind of all the same thing, and you just season to taste based on your personal preference of how you actually want to win the game.
So the final deck of the top 8 was a 4-color Up the Beanstalk control deck list. And very notably, that had main deck Ghost Vacuum in it, as well as more Ghost Vacuum and Nihil Spellbomb in the sideboard. That is a very strong statement about where that player thought the metagame was.
Yep. That has undertones. Remember, and this feels quaint now, remember during the expressive iteration metagame when we on this podcast and we as a community were discussing whether main deck Pyroblast is a sign of health or not? Like, is that a sign that the format's broken if you're willing to main deck a Pyroblast? Or is that just good tuning for your expected metagame? Or are those the same thing? And Ghost Vacuum is so much more specific and embarrassing than Pyroblast. Like, that is a big, stupid problem. That's a card that we need to put in main decks. And basically all decks that aren't either an Ancient Tomb deck or a Reanimator deck themselves, like all the fair Ponder decks right now, are playing Graveyard Hate in the main. Like, I start every fair deck I try to build with 2 Nihil Spellbombs and then figure out what else I'm doing. Like, you just have to engage there, and it has to be in the main.
So if we want to look beyond just top 8, and I think that's very important to do, if we want to look at the top 32, we are dealing with 3 Nadu combo deck lists, 7 blue-black Reanimator deck lists, 4 Eldrazi, 2 Mystic Forge, 1 Maverick, 3 Painter, 1 Death and Taxes, 1 Jeskai Control, 1 very, very spicy Elves deck list, and then a Moon Stompy deck list rounding it all out.
Shout out to that Maverick player. I played Maverick on the channel recently, and I will caveat this with I was sent kind of the classic platonic ideal of Maverick, not a hyper-tuned one for the current metagame, which might have just been a mistake. But I laid out that deck at the end of the video and was like, what cards here have been printed after 2012? And it was like, there was like 1 Keen-Eyed Curator in the Greenslin Zenith package or something. It was like sub 5 cards that have been printed after 2011, 2012. And I don't know what they were doing, but kudos to them for being bold enough to register Maverick. Was this literally Dukes? Japan's not that far from Australia relative to the everywhere else in the earth. Like, I don't know. Is it Dukes? Dukes, please.
No.
Okay.
There were 2 Barrogoyfs, 2 White of the Reliquaries. But yeah, otherwise those are mostly old cards.
Yeah. Well, shout out to that person for making it happen. But I'm going to just preview the second half of our episode where decks not to play at Eternal Weekend. I'm going to put Maverick in that pile. I'm just going to do it now, unless you're this incredible human who made it happen. Across the numbers here, the top 32, it still bears out. Just the MTG Goldfish front page. Top 8 was 3 Reanimator, 2 Eldrazi. The top 2 decks are Reanimator and Eldrazi. Top 32, 7 Reanimator and 4 Eldrazi. Those are the top 2 decks in order of the top 32 representation as well. Painter has been a top 5 deck. It's like, I think 6th or 7th right now, but there's 3 of those. There's 3 Nadus. This is literally just the front page of Goldfish bearing out over a large sample size.
So one thing that was true of last year's Eternal Weekend, and I think you could look at this Eternal Weekend as well, there were some decks that see play in Japan that never really translate to the other 2 events. So Sneak and Show is a pretty good example of a deck that always sees a lot more play when you're in Japan than either of the Prague or United States Eternal Weekends. And then maybe this is just me looking in the Storm Discord, but Japan also has a lot of Ant decks, which isn't something you see a whole lot of, but Japan seems to love their Ad Nauseam Tendrils variants. So I thought that those were interesting call-outs.
And we can get some exact numbers on how many players submitted what from the Legacy Data Collection project. So we had 130 blue-black Reanimator players, 52 Eldrazi players, 25 blue-black Tempo players, 35 Moon Stompy, 35 Painter, 26 Sneak and Show. And we even have some stuff like win rates for those decks. You can look at the Legacy Data Collection spreadsheet if you're interested in that. Notably, the blue-black Reanimator deck list, which is about 20% of the metagame at this event, is slightly above a 56% win rate, excluding the mirror matches. And that tends to be the
line.
That's a little bit above the line as far as like, we need to take action on this format. a lot of times I remember like 55% as a number being cited where like, hey, that's not fucking okay. We're past it, but we're stuck with it.
I'm going to tap the sign again of Goldfish front page. This pod is not sponsored by MTG Goldfish, but if you all want to work together, we do like what you offer. But about slightly over 20% of the meta, Blue-Black Reanimator in Japan. Blue-Black Reanimator, according to MTG Goldfish, 23.6% of the meta. Like, we are on the numbers here. Eldrazi, according to Goldfish, is just under 14% of the meta. That number is a little smaller, but there are slightly less than half as many Eldrazi players as there are Blue-Black, and 14 is slightly more than half of 23, according to like the Goldfish data. So when we're talking about preparing for a Turtle weekend and, you know, people play what they have, they play what they like. Some people are just there on vacation. Maybe that's true, but also, you know, leagues are noise. Are they? If this data just bears out over and over again, that large events tend to match up to what Goldfish has observed over the last few months.
There's also some pretty interesting popular cards that you could take a look at. Gentlemen, 921 copies of Consigned to Memory, with only 621 people in the event. I'm sorry, 614 people in the event. That's a lot of Consigned to Memories. They're basically in every blue deck sideboard at this point, and you have to play around it.
Right. I've been talking about that for a couple weeks now, and not that anyone needed me to stamp my approval on that card, but Consigned to Memory, just, it is hard to believe that this card exists. I think I did this on the pod 1 or 2 episodes ago, where you just look at a card like this and then think about all of the places it applies, and then realize that it also just has Replicate for reasons that are unclear. Well, we know why it has Replicate, so it could counter Eldrazi and the trigger, but like, it's just difficult to counter. It helps with Storm, helps with Thassa's Oracle, helps with Eldrazi, helps with the One Ring, helps with Chalice of the Void, helps with Vexing Bauble. Like, you could even cast a spell and then counter the Vexing Bauble or Chalice of the Void trigger with Consigned to Memory plus Replicate and force a spell through if you have a bunch of mana and just need to resolve a 1-drop. If you have enough mana, you could even do something like Ponder, Brainstorm into a Chalice, and all 3 of the Chalices trigger, and then you replicate Consign 3 times and counter all of the Chalice triggers and resolve all your 1-drops. Like, these are lines that exist. This card is so sexy.
And it catches a bunch of the bullshit of the format that you might run into in early rounds. So, for example, I played against a Cascade-based combo deck today that just wanted to play Violent Outburst into Tybalt's Trickery. Yeah, counter a Cascade trigger, wasteland your land. Nice deck.
Yep, game.
827 copies of Psychic Frog. Yawn. 372 copies of Metamorphosis Fanatic. What's interesting to me, 367 copies of Barrowglyph. That's 5 less than Fanatic. That's a lot of Barrowglyphs.
Glyph's a sicko. If you don't own those cards and you're a Legacy completionist, or you might play Blue-Black, or you're just I show up to Legacy once a year and I want to win when I do kind of person, you probably need to own 2 or 3 Barrowglyphs. This thing is just the truth. It's so big. It draws cards when it hits. Just a beautiful Magic card. I'm not mad about Barrowglyph. I'm very mad about Psychic Frog. Like, I think that's kind of the balance where Barrowglyph is just really big. You're incentivized to block it, though it has Death Touch and Lifelink, so it's really hard to beat in combat. And it's so big that it's even hard to get a trade off of. Like, I've reanimated Atraxa into a Barrowglyph before, and I lose because Barrowglyph, I just have to block it. I can't let them keep getting cards off it. I think this is the sweet spot that Psychic Frog was trying to find, and it overshot. And Barrowglyph is so nice. I love this card. I'm glad it's getting the respect it deserves.
Same. And it also doesn't draw a card every turn. Sometimes it misses. That's great.
Right. But even when it misses, it grows.
It does.
345 copies of Ghost Vacuum.
Got to keep those Barrowglyphs in check.
287 copies of Tamio Inquisitive Student. That one I think might actually be under what I would have guessed. Because I see that card all the time, but maybe because it's always like a 2 of, it's not getting the numbers, but it's everywhere right now.
It just isn't in Reanimator right now. The Metamorphosis Fanatic slots had to go somewhere, and the decks that were just using Tamio is just sort of another thing that's worth removing to keep velocity. Those are just Metamorphosis Fanatics now, and you have to be a non-Reanimator deck to be interested in Tamio.
All right. Do we have any final thoughts about EW Asia before we start talking about prepping for the other Eternal Weekend events?
I think same thing we've been saying. You're going to have to beat Psychic Frog at this event, and also just respect the metagame data that's out there. The paper stuff might be a little different, but certainly this event, it looks like you just copied and pasted Goldfish information into a human event.
3-for-1 Trading is one of Europe's leading Magic the Gathering traders. Their online shop has a fantastic selection of high-end Magic cards, especially for vintage, legacy, and old-school players. You can find them at shop.3for1trading.com or visit their booth at major events. They run weekly sales, and new, individually scanned high-end cards are added every Wednesday. Use code EternalGlory to get our community-exclusive offer of free worldwide shipping on your first order over $500 and experience their world-class customer service and exact grading for yourself.
Now, are we ready to cause some drama?
I heard that we weren't supposed to play Maverick. Is that what this section is about?
Kind of. So this is meant to be constructive, and we're not just executing drive-bys on random people in the decks they like. But in terms of if you want to win Eternal Weekend, this is an 11 or 12 round event plus top 8. You have to win 14 or 15 matches of Magic to walk away with the trophy. And you're going to have to win 11 out of your 12 Swiss rounds to get that top 8 promo. That is a very high win rate. Over 90% is what you have to show up with here. And we're going to talk about both generic how to stay strong over 12 rounds of a game that has inherent variance in it, as well as some metagame specific stuff that's going on right now. And remember, if you go back, if you missed this episode, it was a good one. I think we called it like building mental muscles or something. It was an episode we did a long time ago where we talked about expectations at Magic events, and the best players in Magic's history, your Finkles, your Kais, your LSVs, Paulo Vitor Damarosa, they're boasting like 63, 64% win rates over the course of their career. And we are talking about needing to be like 95% on the day to win Eternal Weekend. So if you want to give yourself the best chance to be in that pro level 65% pocket and then also run good to get the other 30% you're going to need to win the tournament, don't play these decks.
So, deck number 1, top of the list, Oops All Spells. But that deck can win on turn 1 with protection. Why would I not want to do this?
Yeah, this is the poster child of what I call like coin flip decks, where yes, and none of these decks are truly embarrassing. All of these decks are fine. All of these decks can win an FNM. All these decks can win a 5-0 Moto League. You could top 8 a MTGO Challenge. You might even top 8 Eternal Weekend if you are just the GOAT with this thing. But when we're talking about like a deck like Oops All Spells, and I'll just lump Necrodominant Storm in there with it, I think that is way worse than Oops All Spells while doing the same thing. I actually think that deck is just heinous. I don't think Oops All Spells is bad, but I think it's a bad choice for a 12-round event. But decks like this, where the first thing you have to pass is Force Check. So, 40% of the time, your blue opponent is just going to have the thing. And that's not counting for if they play a Force of Negation in the main. And that's not counting for the current metagame where there might just be main deck graveyard hate. And it's not counting for the half the time where you're just on the draw, which now opens up Spell Pierce, Thoughtseize, all this graveyard hate in the main. There are so many things that have to line up right for you to win 11 out of 12 matches in a row. And then the sideboard comes in, and everyone's going to have it because the best deck in the format is a graveyard combo deck.
So I see 12 post in this section as well. Why don't we like that? You can have 4 mana on turn 2 if you line up your Planar Nexus with your Tron land.
Well, the best decks in the format are all Wasteland decks, and the ones that are not Wasteland decks are Blood Moon decks. 12 post is a deck that puts the slow blue control decks in the ground. It is horrible. It's like the worst matchup. The people who are trying Jeskai control right now are doing stuff like multiple main deck back to basics. I worked on a Jeskai control list, blue-white control list with somebody just the other day. They had 5 back to basics / Harbinger of the Seas / Blood Moon / Ruinations across their 75. That's what that deck has to do to be competitive with a deck like 12 post. But if your opponent goes like Eldrazi Linebreaker, Wasteland you, Sowing Mycospawn to another Wasteland, it's already over.
All right. Now, I think our co-hosts here disagree about the next one, Mystic Forge combo.
Okay, I'll be the executioner first, and it seems like Bryant has a rebuttal. I don't know what it is yet, but he made notes about it. I think that this deck, you're taking all the variants inherent in an Ancient Tomb strategy and a strategy that is soft to Force of Will and prone to mulligans, and then you're shoving it into a format where, what did we say? 921 copies of Consigned to Memory were registered in Japan. I feel like this is probably the best deck that we're going to talk about on this list. Like, according to Goldfish, it is a top 10 deck. It has been for a while, but I don't like flipping that coin for 12 rounds. Bryant, please rebut me.
So I'd like to start off by saying I hate this deck. I hope that nobody plays it. I do not like it. F. Karn the Great Creator, also what I like to call Karn the Great Piece of Trash. Okay? Do not like this deck. It crushes me. I don't like people that play Karn, all that good stuff.
Wow, whoa, hold on, pause. You don't like people who play Karn? That just went from I don't like this deck to I don't like these people personally.
Yeah.
I think you've crossed a line. You need to apologize to Phil.
No, trash people play trash cards. I stand by it.
Wow. The views of Brian Cook do not reflect the other hosts of the Eternal Glory podcast, nor our sponsors. Shop at 341trading.com and call Jonathan Sparks for legal representation.
All right, going back to Mystic Forge combo. So when you look at Modern Horizons 3, the deck changed. It was a deck that was playing Lion's Eye Diamonds and more copies of Lotus Petal, Mox Opal, that sort of stuff. And it's shifted to now be like a Glaring Fleshraker deck, and it plays 4 copies of Vexing Bauble. So now you have 4 of this one-sided defense grid that you can grab off of your Urza Sagas that kind of change the control matchups, because traditionally with this deck, you mulligan to any hand that could play a 4-drop colorless spell on turn 1. That shifts now because you have Urza Saga into Vexing Bauble, especially against blue decks. So you're not always looking for that explosive turn 1, but you're looking for something that is consistent and does something powerful. And consistent is interesting now because there's Kozilek's Command. You have another large thing that you can dump all of your mana into that then replaces itself on mana and digs you for the 4-mana thing that's best in that specific matchup. So if you're into ruining my day, you can dig for Karn the Great Creator. If you're trying to beat Phil, you might want the One Ring. And if you're trying to beat Brian, you might want Mystic Forge. And now you have a consistency piece that digs for it. And, I don't think that this deck is bad. Like, I do think it's fairly good. But what's changed my opinion recently is that you're seeing some notable players doing well in legacy challenges. Juju Bean, for example, has put up multiple 5-0s and has started top 8ing legacy challenges with this deck. And if Juju Bean, who, qualifies for the Mox each year, what it seems like, is now playing this deck, there's probably something there. And I don't think it's just folds to Consigned to Memory, because if it was the case, it wouldn't be putting up the numbers that it is right now.
Yeah, I don't think it folds to Consigned to Memory. I don't think it folds to anything. I just think that this deck that has no actual interaction other than the 4 Kozilek's Command, which is a big upgrade, but this deck doesn't have like Force of Will or Daze, or there's one Soul Guide Lantern in the main of a list I'm looking at here. Is this deck going to keep up with just Archon of Cruelty backed by Force of Will on average over 12 rounds? And then especially if we're boarding in Blood Moons, Back to Basics, Consigned to Memories, all this other stuff, is this deck favored versus the other Ancient Tomb decks that are attacking? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. And Red Stompy is a top 5 deck, and this is a top 10 deck. Maybe that's the difference. But certainly take note. I am looking at a list on Goldfish right now, and I see 1, 2, 3 different 5-0s posted over the last couple of weeks by Juju, who has won Eternal Weekend Legacy twice. So it's worth noting. I can't see it, though. I don't think I would roll these dice and just hope the machine keeps running for 12 rounds.
So I do think I have an issue with one thing you said, which is you don't have Force of Will. What are you going to do to Archon? That's over 50% of Legacy. Not everyone is going to register Force of Will. So I don't know if that's exactly fair, but they do have Mindbreak Trap in the sideboard for some aggressive decks. Also another thing that I can't stand. And then they have 3 copies of Fairy Macabre, so they at least have an answer to the Archon of Cruelty that is uncounterable. And it plays well with the Vexing Bauble that we mentioned earlier. So I do think there's some stuff there, but needing interaction in a deck to be playable, I don't know if I agree with, because a lot of linear strategies can get away without playing as many answers because they're trying to do their proactive thing to go over what the blue-black reanimator things are trying to do.
Right. This deck could absorb an Archon trigger and then untap and win. That could happen. I don't think it's going to beat an Archon backed by Force of Will, though. I think it could push through a Force of Will. I think it can absorb an Archon trigger, maybe even an Archon attack. But if A and B are in place for the Reanimator deck, I think this deck is going to be really far behind. And they're not always going to have both. But what we're not talking about, like, is this deck okay for FNM or is this good for a 6-round MTGO challenge? We're talking about boasting a 95% win rate over the course of one single day. Like, is this deck going to hold that?
You know, I will agree with you because I don't want to face it. I will tell everyone to not play it.
Okay. But like I said, this is like the best represented deck, the strongest deck by the numbers that I'm going to say don't play. And Bryant seems to think it's good. So maybe go ahead, play it. I hope Juju wins Eternal Weekend with it.
But what about all those sweet FNM decks that can't really beat a Psychic Frog, but they do well at your locals? Like, there's a lot of decks that fall into this category. Like, Burn is a classic deck that like people bring to an FNM. A lot of different Stompy variants, Merfolk Slivers, Nick Fit, Pox, your Sultide Depths decks, Ruby Storm. Like, where do all of these fit in?
I think a lot of people who show up to large events with these deck lists believe that they have a good matchup versus the best deck in the format. And they might believe this because they are the best player in their local metagame, not one of the best players in, their state or their country. And when you get put on the larger stage against better players who have flown from across the country to play, your deck with your air quotes, your good Delver matchup, your good blue-black Reanimator matchup might just be winning locally, and you don't actually have the good matchup that you think you have.
Yeah, I think that Ruby Storm doesn't match with all the other things we listed, because I think Ruby Storm is like as good as any other, like we just had everything we just said about Mystic Forge combo, like absorb an Archon trigger and then just untap and win. I think Ruby Storm has that puncher's chance. I think maybe that belongs in the last category more than this one. But as far as like all this other stuff, like Burn, like maybe your friends just want to go to Eternal Weekend, but you don't really play Legacy, and you're just the fifth person in the car, and you could get Burn together. You own Basic Mountains and Fire Blasts. We're in. You're just not going to be successful with that this year. We talked about Metamorphosis Fanatic at 372 copies. You probably weren't going to beat Burn before they had giant lifelink bodies in their deck, and now they do. So it's okay to just hang out and play side events if that's your option. And again, it's really important, and I want to stress that it is okay to be on vacation. It is okay to show up and not have high expectations. It is worth your entertainment budget while you're on vacation. It's probably cheaper than seeing a football game to join Eternal Weekend and have a half day of entertainment while you wait for your friends to lose and you just play out whatever rounds you're in. It's fine to do that. And you can play whatever you want to do that. You're not a bad person. But if you are serious about winning Eternal Weekend, you cannot register Burn. And we have a bunch of creature decks here. I mentioned earlier in the show, it might have been in the pre-show even, where I recorded with Slivers last week. And you can have the curve out. Like I went like Aether Vial into Cavern of Souls, Muscle Sliver, Chrysalid Sliver, Cloud Shredder Sliver, a bunch of Flying Shroud, Haste, big monsters, and one Psychic Frog bricks it. You just discard 3 cards, jump the Frog, block the Cloud Shredder. Now things don't fly anymore, and they're all smaller than Frog. You just cannot beat a Psychic Frog with a deck like that. And I have definitely played against Merfolk last year at Eternal Weekend in like round 4. It wasn't even round 1. There are folks who are going to register these, and we just want to give you realistic expectations.
So a very important thing about Legacy right now is that it is generally speaking quite fast. The bar of the format is end of turn Entomb on turn 1, reanimate or animate dead on turn 2. Or
See Fairy Macabre discussion from earlier.
Or Psychic Frog on turn 2. Or Glaring Flesh Raker on turn 2, threaten to do absolutely disgusting things on turn 3. And so when you are choosing your deck, maybe don't pick something that's slow. Like, do you want to be registering traditional blue-white miracles right now? Do you want to spend time setting up something like a Terminus? Or do you just want to remove a creature and move on? Can you really afford to spend 3 turns looking for your win condition because you are playing 3 of them? Or do you just want to fill your deck with good cards, be that, Murktide Regent, 4th Aerlingas, your own Psychic Frogs, your own Tamios? Do you want to have a high threat density so you don't need to dig for a win condition? You can just have one.
Yeah, that's a huge problem right now. Obviously, I have been exploring the Blue-White X slow ponder shells because that's what I would like to do, all things being equal. And Phil mentioned this format's fast. This might be the fastest Legacy format I can remember. I don't, maybe like the 5 days Underworld Breach was legal, but even cards like Dreadhorde Arcanist, I think, was slower than Psychic Frog because that wasn't being put in combo decks. Expressive Iteration lended itself to longer games, not shorter ones. Oko lended itself to longer games, not shorter ones. Like, this might be the fastest Legacy we've had in modern memory, and that makes it extreme in the blue-white control decks. The blue-white control decks lose when their cards don't line up. When you draw 3 plows and no forces versus a creature deck, you feel unbeatable. When you back up Deafening Silence with a Force of Will against a combo deck, you feel unbeatable. But when you draw 3 plows versus combo, you feel like you were never in that game. And just the moving target of having the wrong thing in your hand is what you have to pass, the check you have to pass for 12 consecutive rounds. And the format's so fast that there is no room to have 4th Aerlingus in your opening hand or Jace the Mind Sculptor in your opening hand. Whatever it is you want to actually win the game with, you cannot afford to even look at that card until you're ready to win the game. And that means that these decks are being built with 2 win conditions in it. I'm looking at one right now that has 2 4th Aerlingus and a Days Undoing. And Days Undoing doesn't win the game, especially if your opponent knows that you only have 2 4th Aerlingus to close after that point. It's really, really bad right now, what you have to do to survive the first 3 turns. And then it makes it really hard to actually win when the coast is clear to do that.
So I think an important comparison here is, like, let's look at the 4 or 5 color control deck list from the top 8 of the event. 3 Murktide Regent, 3 Psychic Frog, 4 Tameo, 1 Uro. That is 11 creature-based win conditions there. And Psychic Frogs and Murktide Regents can be played early in the game, as can Tameo. Like, it is a very different sort of control deck right now from the, like, draw, go, answer your thing, win eventually control decks that we often see.
Right. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a frog is a good guy with a frog. And supporting your frog with Up the Beanstalk and Swords to Plowshares makes you the good guy in the frog world.
I have a few points I would like to make here. Brian was talking about how fast the format is and having your right cards in the right matchups and line up. One thing that these control decks have that's traditionally made this okay is Ponder and Brainstorm to swap out those cards when things aren't going well the right way. So if you're facing a combo weirdo like me and you have Swords to Plowshares in your hand, you're like, okay, well, I can Brainstorm on turn 2, fetch, play Ponder, look for a counter spell, that sort of thing. That doesn't work at the moment because the format is so fast, and you just can't afford to be sitting there with Swords to Plowshares in your hand at the wrong time. So that is what Brian means. It's not that Swords to Plowshares is bad. It's not that Brainstorm is bad. It's just like, if your deck is very reactive right now, you're planning on taking extra time to fix your hand in those matchups after you figure out what your opponent's doing. And the format feels a little too fast for that to actually be viable at the moment. Another big difference is that on Magic Online, you could be the fastest control player in the West. Like, you could be like, I play so fast that I win with 15 minutes on the clock in game 3. I'm so, like, competitive. At Eternal Weekend, you're going to be sharing a round clock with your opponent. And if you're on one of these control decks with only 2 win conditions, Your opponent might not be playing at a pace that you find acceptable, but a judge might find it acceptable, even if you call them for slow play. So you have to be able to find that win condition on time, turn the corner, and win in 50 minutes. So that's something else you have to think about, because there is the difference between Magic Online and paper, and I feel like we just have to mention that right now.
Yeah, I stopped registering Uro during the expressive iteration metagame because my Uro decks, even though I couldn't lose, also could rarely win if the opponent wasn't on the level of respecting the fact that I'm a slow-ass Uro deck, and every second they spend thinking is a second that I don't get to spin my wheels looking for Uro to close the game once I'm in control. And in some cases, it is unfair. I could think of a match against a Sneak and Show player who was clearly just, he was out for a stroll that day, and it was driving me nuts. But there are lots of matches where it is not my opponent's job to ponder in under 3 seconds so I can spin my wheels and find my win condition later. If it takes them 20, 30 seconds to ponder, that's within the total range of how it's okay to play Magic. And my last thought on these blue-white control decks, and it really is a shame how fast the format is, and they're basically pushing these out from viability, because Wrath of the Skies is just a generational game changer of a Wrath. Like, this main deck card is so sexy and does so much. And honestly, Wrath of the Skies is the only reason anyone's even thinking about Jeskai right now. And if the format slowed down even a little bit, I think this is going to surge up because Wrath is just so good. If people are actually planning to play 2 or 3 turns of Legacy instead of 1 or 2.
So there's one more control deck or slow deck on our list, and that's Lands, which is a deck that a lot of people love in paper. Like, it's a very popular paper deck. Those people that own a Tabernacle would like to use it that one time a year. That said, it's not a very fast deck. Like, you do have the Dark Depths, Thespian Stage quick win, but a lot of lists are cutting down to like 2 of each copy, or like maybe 3 Stage 2 depths. And the format, or the deck, has slowed down. I've been studying recent lists because of tutoring sessions and whatnot. And then today I was doing some research on where Lands was in the metagame. Less than 1% of the field. In fact, according to MTG Goldfish, it has the same metagame share as Ad Nauseam Tendrils, if that tells you anything. Like, Lands has taken a huge hit recently, and if you're someone that owns your Tabernacle, I might be looking at something like Selesnya Depths instead. If you want to play that style deck, maybe you play the deck that can turn on a dime a little more quickly.
So I guess as a final warning here, you remember how many times we have mentioned Ghost Vacuum, Fairy Macabre in this video? If you are thinking about playing a graveyard-oriented deck list, think twice about that. These blue-black decks that are at the top of the metagame can just ignore the graveyard sometimes. They can just play a Psychic Frog, funnel a bunch of cards into it, and kill you. But if you are thinking about registering an all-in reanimator deck, like a black-red reanimator deck, or a dredge deck, or anything else that would get kind of caught in the crossfire of all of these various pieces of graveyard hate, some of which are main deck, like, you might want to ask yourself whether or not you're actually trying to win the event.
Right. Like, Dredge is pretty tough if people are main decking graveyard hate like this. And Dredge can play like Oops All spells, but we already talked about Oops All spells. And Dredge could play slow and steady, but we already talked about blue, white, and lands. Just a slow Dredge game plan. And those things both didn't quite clear the bar. I think there might be a hole for a fast reanimator to exploit. Like, if you're just faster than the reanimator plan out of blue-black, to the point where you get to ignore their tempo game and Psychic Frog, that's cool. But you got to figure out what your sideboard plan looks like, because they can juke off of their plan and into a highly disruptive deck. Them discarding and reanimating your monsters is really embarrassing. Like, you really got to solve for that. So your mileage may vary there. How fast the reanimator goes. Like, if we're talking about like Dark Ritual Unmask, make you dead, that might be good enough here or there. But again, if we build it that way, it starts to slide into that coin flip deck territory that we talked about already. So those are the decks that we think you probably want to avoid. And if you know something we don't, come to Eternal Weekend and prove us wrong.